Good morning, everyone. I'm Jared Martin from the Department of Psychology at the University of Pretoria. I'm going to be presenting some data from a study myself and my colleagues, Charles van Wyk, Nicoline Coetzee, and Kobe Hayes, recently conducted with the South African Navy. The title of the study is Masculine Role Norms and Attitudes Towards Transgender People Serving in the Navy, an exploratory study in the South African context. So we know that the increasing visibility and rights of transgender people within military context has sparked debate and policy reconsiderations worldwide. Some militaries have kind of proactively worked towards policies of inclusive enlistment and service for transgender people wishing to serve or wanting to serve their country. Others have, however, and this is the overwhelming majority, have opted either for complete bans on transgender people enlisting in their military, or if they're already serving in the military, discharging them from their enlistment, or partial bans on their service. So these are a kind of spectrum of complete or partial bans to their service. The context of this study, therefore, is that debates around the inclusion or exclusion of transgender individuals from military service have, however, been underpinned by the same kind of normative discourses around gender, and in particular, traditional ideologies of masculinity, or TMI, that have long shaped the exclusion of openly lesbian, gay, bisexual people, as well as cisgender women. So the same discourses that underpin the exclusion of previous groups from military service, the same are being employed. And often those debates are around that the inclusion of transgender people, much like the inclusion of openly gay, lesbian, bisexual people and women, will somehow damage unit morale or will be deleterious on unit cohesion. With transgender people in particular, there is a additional discourse to that debate, which centers around the cost incurred by militaries to assisting people who come out as transgender during the course of their service. There's a discourse around how much the cost incurred by militaries to pay for gender transitioning or gender reassignment surgeries. Existing research does, however, show that the cost is negligible to militaries where they pay for partially or fully gender transitioning processes or gender reassignment surgeries. So the existing research currently tells us that traditional masculinity ideology, endorsement of TMI, acts as a significant predictor for more negative attitudes, in other words, less inclusive attitudes or exclusionary attitudes towards sexual and gender diversity. What we specifically know from studies conducted with the US military is that there are varying levels of support to transgender people enlisting and serving in the military. These studies, however, tend to show us that in the main, there is support amongst actively enlisted personnel for transgender people serving in the military. However, where personnel are slightly more conservative, more religious, and have a lower, higher level of education, they tend to be less supportive or less inclusive. Research also tells us that while service personnel are open to transgender people serving in their military, they do believe that no additional support, such as the military supporting gender transitioning process, should be given to transgender personnel. However, most of these studies are kind of dominated. The existing literature is dominated by militaries in the global north and west. There is a recently published study conducted on some army personnel in Brazil. So that's the first kind of global south study. And that indicates holistically negative attitudes towards transgender people serving in the military. So kind of the question or the gap in the existing research is, what is the local picture for us for both a military and in particular a naval force on the African continent, because there is no literature or data on that. So the objectives of the study were first to investigate how a sample of South African Navy men, cisgender Navy men, endorse traditional masculinity or norms of traditional masculinity, to examine their attitudes towards transgender people serving in the Navy, to assess whether or not there are differences, socio-demographic differences in their support for transgender people serving in the South African Navy, and then to investigate the relationship between the endorsement of masculinity and the attitudes towards transgender people serving in the Navy. We adopted a cross-sectional research design methodology. The research proposal underwent IRB review and approval at the University of Pretoria, with all the various security and operational permissions and authorities also received before conducting the study. We recruited a self-identified cisgender sample of 1,113 South African Navy men, all of whom were stationed with the South African Navy Fleet, which is based in Simonstown, South Africa. For the most part, the demographics of the sample, the mean age was 35 years old. The range was 20 to 60. The majority of the sample, ethnically, racially identified as Black African, 57%, so-called colored, 22%, white 15%, and Indian 3.5%. The overwhelming majority of the sample identified as heterosexual, that was 98%, and the majority of the sample possessed an exiting school leaving matric, 70% of which constituted the highest level of education for them. So only a minority possessed undergraduate or postgraduate university awarded degree. How we conducted the study, we employed two measures. The first was a socio-demographic questionnaire, which asked a variety of questions for the participant to self-identify key features anonymously, however. So no personal information was asked in terms of their name, their force number, or identity number, but we wanted to ask them to describe themselves in terms of age, race, their naval rank, mustering, etc. At the end of that socio-demographic questionnaire, we posed a question, a once-off question, which is, do you believe that transgender people should be able to serve in the South African Navy? And we provided the respondent 4 response options: yes, at sea and at shore. That's important for South African, for the naval forces. It won't necessarily be applicable for the Air Force or the Army. Yes, only in shore-based units or posts, so in other words, not in sea-going vessels. No, transgender people should not be able to serve in the South African Navy. Or no, I don't know enough about transgender people. I think in hindsight, and I'll reflect on this if we get to it in the limitations, but we're reflecting on it now as we finalize the manuscript, the question was pretty bad. In the sense that there are ways, I think, in which we could have constructed this specific question and provided more precise response options, a greater variety of response options to the participants. With that said, it doesn't necessarily discount the data because it provides us a very useful snapshot, but certainly are there limitations with how we constructed the question and the response options available? I would certainly agree, yes. To measure masculinity, we use the male role norms inventory, short form, designed by Ron Levant, and that examines 7 hypothesized norms of masculinity as listed in the slide, with a total scale of traditional masculinity ideology. So there's 7 norms of masculinity in addition to a total traditional masculinity ideology scale. In terms of the analyses, we found that both the McDonald's Omega and the Cronbach Alpha were at 0.91, so showing that our use of the TMI was particularly robust with the sample. The scale was quite robust. We also then applied descriptive and inferential statistics to generate some picture of to generate the data picture. So we ran some descriptive statistics to tell us a little bit about the masculine role norms and what was endorsed, what wasn't endorsed by this specific sample. What we found is that restrictive emotionality and dominance were the least endorsed by our naval sample compared to Levant et al.'s original reference sample. We found that self-reliance and toughness were the highest endorsed masculine role norms. And compared to Levant's original reference sample, we found that the total traditional masculinity ideology score was significantly lower, the mean score of 3.1, than the original sample by Levant, which was a sample of largely white university and college students from from the US. So it was quite interesting to see that our military sample had a much lower endorsement of traditional masculinity ideology compared to the original sample of American university students. We conducted a series of one-way ANOVAs to determine whether or not the differences of traditional masculinity ideology scores on different demographic factors, how could those be explained and whether or not there were significant differences. What's interesting to note from the box and whisker plot on the slide is we found a significant difference in traditional masculinity ideology scores on our 4 response options around attitudes towards transgender people serving in the Navy. What we found was that those respondents who said, yes, transgender people should be able to serve at both sea and at shore scored significantly lower. In other words, did not endorse masculinity as highly as those who said, no, transgender people should not be able to serve. And that was a significant difference at 0.001. It was a highly significant difference between those two means. So in other words, what we found is that the higher you endorse masculinity, the less inclusive you appear to be in transgender people serving at sea and at shore in the South African Navy. In terms of objective 2, the attitudes of our sample towards transgender people serving in the Navy, some really interesting findings, I think. The majority of our sample of cisgender men in the South African Navy indicated that they were quite supportive of transgender people serving at both sea and at shore. That was 68.1%, the overwhelming majority. Only 4% indicated transgender people should be able to serve, but only in shore-based posts. And a minority, roughly 24-25% of the sample, indicated that transgender people should not serve, albeit for different reasons, either because they didn't know enough or that they said transgender people should not be able to serve at sea or at shore. So what's interesting from the surface is that our study already begins to buck the trend from existing literature, which demonstrates relatively open, supportive, inclusive attitudes towards transgender people serving in the military. We ran some chi-square tests of independence to establish the association between rank and race, highest level of education, sexual orientation, and attitudes towards transgender people serving in the Navy. The only significant difference, statistical significances we found were in race and higher level and the highest level of education, which aligns with existing literature. I just want to highlight the majority of these findings will be included in the manuscript, but I specifically want to drill down to see if there's socio-demographic differences. And what we found, interestingly, is that across self-identified race, the majority of people, regardless of race, indicated that they were supportive of transgender people serving in the Navy, be it at sea and at shore. So 70% of Black African respondents, 66% of colored respondents, 61% of white, and 61% of Indian respondents indicated that they were supportive of transgender people serving at sea and at shore. Finally, in terms of objective 3, the relationship between masculinity and attitudes towards transgender people, we ran a regression analysis where we used the demographic questionnaires and demographic questions as well as the attitudes towards transgender people. We used those as regressors on traditional masculinity ideology, the total score. What we found was that only the attitudes towards transgender people as well as rank, those were the only significant predictors of traditional masculinity. However, I do want to say that we found that, as I've put in the note, only about 10% of the variance was explained by the regressors that we selected, indicating that, you know, a significant portion of other factors not examined in this study better explain traditional masculinity ideology. But it is worth nonetheless pointing out that we found, as indicated by the yellow marker, a highly significant impact of attitudes towards transgender people serving in the Navy and whether or not you endorsed traditional values around masculinity. So in sum, what does the study find? The descriptive analysis highlighted that the sample of South African Navy men reported the highest mean scores for self-reliance and toughness and the lowest for dominance. I think there's some really interesting hypotheses around why a group of naval and military personnel would indicate toughness and self-reliance, but not so much dominance. The results showed that the majority of the sample were supportive of or reported positive attitudes towards transgender people serving in the Navy, specifically at sea and at shore. And this support was evident across the demographic groups, ethno-racial demographic groups. And then our regression analysis did indicate that attitudes towards transgender personnel significantly predicted the endorsement of traditional masculinity, again showing the linkages between endorsement of traditional masculinity and attitudes towards sexual and gender diversity and trans people in particular. However, it's important to note that only 10% of our regressors were explained by the model. And so there are a whole range of other factors, in other words, that we didn't investigate, which perhaps are more influential on traditional masculinity. Limitations, exceptionally important. There are significant limitations with our study, particularly around the attitudes towards transgender personnel. So we provided the respondents a definition of transgender in case they were not familiar with what transgender meant. We did not, however, specify trans man or trans woman. We indicated a general transgender person, transgender people, generalized category. And that's important to note because what we found is that in existing literature, there appear to be more negative attitudes when you specify trans women compared to trans men. And so I think future research can employ a questionnaire or can specify, rather than the general category of transgender person or transgender people, to specify trans men or trans women. The sample is limited to cisgender men, so we didn't examine cisgender women's attitudes, either towards the endorsement of masculinity or traditional ideologies of femininity, and how that may link to attitudes towards transgender people. And so we only have a partial picture. And of course, we only focused on the South African Navy. So the findings may not necessarily be representative of all men across the South African military. So future directions. Far more comprehensive and robust attitudinal scales are required. I've highlighted the limitations with our question, although I don't think it discounts the data. I think it provides us a really interesting snapshot of a large sample of cisgender South African men and their attitudes towards transgender people. Consideration should be given to examining the attitudes of cisgender women who are serving in the Navy or in the military. And of course, research with other cisgender personnel in other arms of service, like the Air Force and the Army, which far outnumber the South African Navy in terms of the various arms, or the size of the various arms of service in the South African National Defence Force. Existing literature also tells us that there are unique subcultures around toughness, dominance, masculinity in the Army compared to, for example, the South African Navy. And so where we have found relatively supportive attitudes for transgender people serving in the South African Navy, those attitudes may not necessarily hold in the Air Force or in the Army. Thank you very much.